Merling is professor of economics at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. And he was previously professor at Barnard College, Columbia University. And that's also where he taught the course, The Economics of Money and Banking, that he, with INET, turned into a MOOC that turned into being one of the top 10 courses on Coursera, I think in 2014. And that course is probably one of the main reasons we're all here today. And as you all know, he published various books, including most recently Money and Empire, Charles B. Kindleberger, and the Dollar System. His keynote is entitled A Money View of Capitalism, which is inspired by the most recent book of our first discussant, and that is Sven Beckert, Professor Sven Beckert. Professor Sven Beckert is Laird Bell Professor of History at Harvard University. We're really honored to have you here today. His research has focused on the 19th century bourgeoisie, on labor, on democracy, on global history, and on the connections between slavery and capitalism. Some of his most recent works have been Slavery's Capitalism, A New History of American Development, 2016, Empire of Cotton, A Global History, 2014, and most recently, Capitalism, A Global History, 2025. And if you haven't seen it, he has given an excellent interview with INET recently. I'm posting that here in the chat so you can see. Our second discussant is a familiar face, Yakov Fagan, old-time money viewer. Yakov currently is the director of energy at the Center for Public Enterprise. And Yakov previously worked as an associate director at the Berggruen Institute and as a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He has a PhD in economics from University of Pennsylvania. And a PhD in economic history. I'm very sorry. Economic history. I should definitely correct that.
Don't put that shame on me, Jay.
I would never do that. That was wishful thinking, perhaps, but no. And of course, we know Yakov, you're an expert on green bank design, public finance, industrial policy. And your most recent book is Building a Ruin, the Cold War Politics of Soviet Economic Reform, which you published in 2024. And that is a book based on your PhD work. So that's our wonderful start to the Money View Symposium. And we have a little over an hour left for this first iteration. And without any further ado, I welcome to the stage Professor Perry Merling. Perry, take it on.
Yes, let me share my screen. Are you seeing that?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay,
perfectly.
So yes, I'm Sven. I'm so happy that you're here. This is quite an incredible book. 1,000 pages, actually more than 1,000 pages.
Yeah.
More than 1,000 pages, which I read twice, because the first time I read it, I felt like I didn't really understand it. So I needed to read it a second time. So I read it twice. And I believe, I don't remember, Sven, I think I gave a little talk at your seminar, like maybe 10 years ago.
You did, was when I taught with Chris Dizon, yeah.
Yeah. Like, I mean, I think it was 10 years ago. So it was a long time ago. So I'm glad that you remember me and that you accepted the invitation. I see this, I'm hoping this next hour is sort of Money View meets your kind of history of capitalism, and we're going to engage. That's my hope.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you. So here, why is this not going through? Okay, let's see here. There we go. So here's, I sent Sven my slides 24 hours ago. I've added some to, and I've tweaked them a little bit, so they're not exactly, but the gist is the same. So I want to tell you, this is a wonderful book, and you should read it. So even though it's 1,000 pages, it's going to take you a long time. So I think maybe the first bon mot, okay, is from page 39, capitalism was born global. I think this is really great, that to understand that this is not a national system, it's a global system. But that also means that it's a private system because the private, traders are global, states are national. So so here's a couple of other things. Maybe should I read some of them? Um, but states were important. This is what Sven is telling me, and I think maybe channeling Christine Desan a little bit, that capitalists were unable to create capitalism. They needed allies to break the boundaries that hedged them in, and the powerful ally they had was the state. Which this is an important idea. And I've been fighting with Christine for a long time about what I see, because I start with merchants, and private money, and she starts with the state and public money. So here we are. Um, should I read some of the others? I love that quote. Barbados was the center, Boston the periphery. Here we are in Boston. I think that's kind of funny. But it's important. It's important, to appreciate that the history of capitalism, that it could have turned out other ways. Capitalism in more than one way, in more ways than one, was produced on the margins, not the centers. The heterogeneity, and the good institution of secured property rights was built on the bad institution of dispossession. The good institution of wage labor on the bad institution of slavery. Russian Revolution was to industrial capitalism with the hate. These are, Sven, these are lovely little bombs. Thank you. So here's how I think it's important to read this book. Sven says that he was very inspired by Brodel. Okay. And I was very inspired by Brodel myself. Maybe you don't realize that. The Wheels of Commerce, which I read 30 years ago, 35 years ago. And I was very influenced by Brodel, because he is telling you how capitalism worked before the nation state, right? So that it's the merchants, it's the fairs, it's the bills of exchange, and how that all worked before the nation state. So that made me 35 years ago realize, we need a monetary theory that does not depend on the nation state. And so that's what I've been doing my whole life. It really is about Brodel. So the fact that Sven is inspired by Brodel makes me enthusiastic. So I say here, time and geography. So Brodel, you can see there it's like, what does it say there? 13th to 18th century. So what Sven is doing is moving back in time and forward in time. So he starts at 1000 and moves to neoliberalism, the modern time. And he also is much more global. Fernand Brodel is basically a European story. So it's global all the time. I mean, it's Japan, it's China, it's everything. It's much more global than Brodel. So he brings in the state, which is a challenge for me, because I started from Brodel. So I was starting from the merchant capitalism and all of that. And I think Christine Desan was a big influence on him. He says so in the acknowledgments. And so where does the state enter into the money view? Because the money view, as this is our 6th iteration, we are starting from the idea that sort of money comes from merchant capitalism, really. And so where does the state come into this story? That's the challenge. This is a new slide. Sven, you haven't seen this slide. What do historians do? So I want to just tell everyone about your book a little bit, that every chapter I always start my chapters with an epigram, like a quote, and you start your chapters with a little story about some, place in the world and something that's happening. So I say anecdote as an epigram, significant detail. This is what Charlie Kinderberger always insisted on. It's meant to be an illustration of some important theme that you're going to develop. I think it's lovely. It took me a while to. I'm an economist, not a historian. So this was unusual, but I love it. Actually, it's great. What you do that I really don't do is you seem to have read everything. So it's a synthesis of the secondary literature. I hate the secondary literature. So I never really read it. I'm much more a creature of, I love the unplowed field personally. And so because I find the secondary literature distracting because mostly it's wrong. And I think you also think kind of it's mostly wrong, but you read it, So I admire that. And what historians do is to tell stories and to retell stories. And so here's your story, as I understand it. You tell me if I'm wrong about this. So here's the narrative. So what I love about this book is that it starts with long distance trade. Not production, at all. Long distance trade. That your merchants are in these little port cities. They're buying stuff cheap, from one place, and they're selling it expensive, to another place, and that's how they're making money. And it's very, very fascinating. Maybe historians know this. Maybe this is old news to historians, but it's new news to me. So that this was in the original, capitalist world. This was an Asian story, not a European story. It was a Muslim story, not a Christian story. It was an archipelago of capitalism, as Sven says. And 500 years later, the state comes in, and it's an agricultural story. It's about this logic of capitalism extending into the hinterlands, not just these port cities, extending the hinterlands, and it's sugar and cotton and it's slavery and all of that. We'll get to that, and only then later is it the Industrial Revolution. So the normal story about capitalism is that it's the Industrial Revolution. It's Britain. But Sven starts much earlier. Okay. And so he in fact he uses the word first divergence. Maybe that's historians use that word all the time, but this is the first time I've seen it. That in fact Britain and Europe, which were marginal players in the origin of capitalism, suddenly it becomes a Eurocentric system. And I would add, which I'm going to say more about in a minute, it's not just Britain. It's the British currency that becomes the central global currency, and that's 19th century there, and then interwar. Time of Monsters. This is Gramsci. Where basically the globalism collapses a little bit. And we return to regional autarky. But then it gets constructed again. The Trunkel years after World War II, and United States takes over the place of Britain. It's not the British pound; it's the U.S. dollar. The second divergence. And then after I guess 1971, Nixon takes the dollar off gold, and we have the time I grew up in 1970s, which was kind of unpleasant. The the emergence of neoliberalism, financialization, and globalization. So the global origin of capitalism is now basically back on the table. Is where we are. So one of the interesting features of this book, maybe a little distracting, I think Sven is basically a social historian, so he's very interested in sort of the life of labor, the slavery, indentured servants, the origin of wage labor is very interesting. And the justification of slavery through scientific racism and all of that. These are all sort of sub themes, I would say, important themes. Similarly, feminism and the reproduction of labor, the non-capitalist world. That's very present here. Also, nature, fossil fuels, mining, all So this is the point. This is the main point of the book, or maybe it's not the main point, but it is that capitalism was like a tiny little thing, and normal life was in the hinterlands and subsistence farming and all of that, and capitalism basically invaded all of that, gradually over time, over centuries. And what is, so here, my fourth bullet point, political heterogeneity, that it turns out that capitalism is quite adaptable. It doesn't really depend on democracy. It's completely consistent with fascism. It doesn't depend on free labor. It could also be consistent with slave labor. It doesn't depend on free property. It could also be consistent with dispossession. This is a very stimulating and I think correct, view. Connected diversity is what Sven calls it. So I'm an economist, not a historian. So I'm looking in this book for, like, how does Sven think about stuff? What are his analytical frames? Okay. And I think he's basically the first bullet point there, he's basically a neo-Marxist, that it's MCM prime, it's Moses and the Prophets, that it's long distance trade in the first place, buy low, sell high. It's also agriculture, buy low, slavery, sell high, sugar and cotton. It's also industry, buy low, wage labor, sell high, textiles and steel. So it's MCM prime. It's accumulation. Less obvious in the book, but I paid attention to it because I know this, basically from Kindleberger too, is the Lewis model, which is because he sees capitalism as like this little thing, and there's this other world out there that it's sort of invading and also absorbing, surplus labor, the subsistence farming, so forth. And that other world, which is so great about this book, it's not just the Lewis model. The Lewis model was about subsistence farming, and that's the surplus labor, which is coming into manufacturing, but it's also international. So it's other countries, or even unpopulated places where you're growing sugar and so forth. So colonialism. So it's also not just labor, it's also nature. It's coal, it's oil, it's all of that. And that's maybe not so, you have to read the book twice to sort of see that, but at least I did. And I guess the third bullet point there is the emphasis on hierarchy, which I guess is his word for inequality. He's very influenced by Branko Milanovic and the Capitalism Everywhere. That hierarchy is domestic and international, right? That this is not just the 1%, right, in the United States. it's also hierarchy internationally, and we're going to come to that. So this is a new slide too, Sven, that you didn't see. So what do states do? So in the book, it's about security of property and trade routes. It's about contract enforcement and law. It's also about taxation. That monetization. So if you tax workers, then they have to earn money. They can't just be subsistence farmers. They have to actually find a way to earn money. And that's true internationally too, empire. So I want to draw, everyone's attention to a theme in this book, which is the way, this is a point that Sven makes a lot, which is that the United States, by occupying this entire continent, and killing all of the indigenous population, this was a challenge to Europe. That they had to, they were threatened by this, and so this whole thing about Africa, about how Europe wanted to occupy Africa or Eastern Europe. I didn't know anything about this, and maybe historians all know about this, but I didn't know about this. So thank you, Sven, for bringing this to my attention. The last part of the book is about neoliberalism. So my colleague Slobodian, which is how I know about neoliberalism, Quinn, emphasizes that the state is about creating the market, not that the is not natural, which Smith and so forth, truck and barter and so forth. So it is the state that creates the boundaries. So that's what do states do. That's a very interesting. So what is capitalism? These are just some quotes about capitalism, one from the beginning of the book, one from the end of the book, but they're the same, really. Commodification of inputs, outputs. So commodification, what is commodification? Commodification means that these things are now saleable for money. This is a money view, right? But that's what commodification means, okay? And private property, so we're gonna come to that. So here's how Sven, I think, you can tell me if I'm wrong about this. As I say, I think he's sort of a neo-Marxist. So he emphasizes agency, okay? What is the story? The main story is about capitalists and the state, codependence, that they're helping each other to expand the geographical extent of capitalism. And it's a back and forth thing, and it's an up and down thing. And that's the first point. And the second point is that there's resistance to this. People don't like this. Labor doesn't like this. The traditional, agricultural elites don't like this. The tributary, elites, they don't like this. And so they try to resist it. And so the state helps to overcome this. And that's his main story, is sort of a class story. Capitalists and the state versus labor and the traditional elites. One of the things I love about this book, he loves paradox. Anti-colonialism is an agency of capitalist expansion. It's resistance, but it actually winds up, expanding capitalism. And that Marx and Engels, are at the forefront of respectable labor movements. Stalin is the most ruthless advocate of industrialization. So Sven loves industrialization, but he doesn't like money. No banks. So this is typical historian, that they're materialists, and I'm not a materialist, So Sven knows about money. Bills of exchange make their appearance, hawala, mortgages, state bonds, futures, debt peonage, student loans, and in fact also treasure. for asymmetric trade, from the west, Potosi, to the east, that it flows from the mines of South America to the hordes of China and India. He knows about that, but it's not really part of the central part of the story. What I Sven, you've read a lot of economists, okay, and you are interested in them, and you're trying to understand. You mostly understand them as sort of scientific racism, I guess. That they're justifications for the capitalist expansion. Smith, if I may say, 3 times you say utility maximizing. Utility, of course, as only comes with the marginalists, not with Smith. This is your editor's problem, and but it's okay. It's not a major problem. I want to draw attention that Gramsci and Polanyi are clearly, important influences. So there are these pages where there's kind of I don't know, a, a, a history of economic thought. Marginalists, Keynes, the post-colonials, Hayek, all of that. So the history of economic thought is very interesting to you, and but it's sort of, maybe I can criticize. It's a potted history of economic thought. It's not. I know. I've read all of these people, and it's not. Well, we'll come to that. You've missed some people that I tell about. And the money view, in other words, this is the standard history of economic thought, really. And so, and I think you're probably right that it's theology. I think that's probably right. So it's so now we come to the money view. How can we help? How can we have a conversation? So the money view emphasizes the centrality of the settlement constraint. And there are a number of moments in this book where you see that settlement, or where I see that settlement constraint, which, for example, when the state starts to require taxes to be payable in money instead of in labor, so you need to earn money. How do you earn money? You have to take a job that pays money, So this is, I think, more important than you emphasize. Similarly, countries, when balance of payments, you emphasize that initially countries were, I would say, were trying to kind of satisfy the settlement constraint by import substitution, meaning not buying stuff from abroad in order to not confront this settlement constraint, and then export orientations, so selling stuff abroad in order to gain money. So this is the same thing, that these are kind of taxes payable in money. The third bullet point there, very fascinating. You emphasize the illiquidity of fixed capital. Fordism. When there's, when you have a huge factory and you can't move it, you can't sell it. This is really an exposure to the settlement constraint that is very dangerous, actually. And the fact that the state sort of helped you, or vertical integration helps you, horizontal integration helps you, that you are not, if you have vertical integration, horizontal integration, you don't face the settlement constraint, because these are all inside in your business. So this is what I notice in your book. Second, what actually is capital? So, like Marx, this book tends to think of capital as kind of a thing, a material thing, that you're you're increasing MCM prime. Okay. From the money view, capital is not a thing. Okay, it's a balance sheet construction. It's a solvency. This is my little meme here. Solvency is an accounting fiction. Liquidity is a market fact. Okay, and or the veil of money is the very fabric of market society, and state war finance relies on private finance, essentially hybrid. So I think capital. What is capital? It's not a material thing. It's an accounting thing. It's an accounting thing, and I'll just stop there and move on. So here's some things that will be familiar to most of the people on here, on this call. So Sven is very interested in hierarchy, inequality, international. And so here's the money view version of that inequality, which is that there's at the top of the hierarchy, there's a key currency, then there's the global north, meaning Europe, Japan, so forth. By the way, I really loved all that. Switzerland is in there a lot. I was just at the BIS in Basel, and so I was very fascinated by the history of Basel. Maybe we can talk about that. Then down below that, the emerging markets, and then the developing world. So yes, the way that the monetary system works, it does create hierarchy. It works on hierarchy. Maybe that's a different concept of hierarchy than you emphasize. But I think we maybe it's related. Maybe we can talk about that. So the international hierarchy of hybridity. So now we're bringing the state in, right? That at the top of the hierarchy, it's all private. It's private banking. At the bottom of the hierarchy, it's all public. And in between, it's a hybrid. And from a monetary point of view, so that's why I emphasize private money, as opposed to Christine Desan, who emphasized public money. But public money is for, the bottom of the hierarchy, where they don't have financial markets really. And the dollar is mostly JP Morgan and people like that. So the people on this call have seen this slide before, so here's maybe a way to really drive that home. I see Iñaki is on this call, so he will recognize this because I learned this from him. That after the financial crisis, what happened was not the collapse of the dollar, but the expansion of the dollar to the global south. Okay, and here's how it happened: that the emerging market economies, that's what EME is, because they were willing to pay 10% on their bonds, while there's zero interest rates in the global north. And so as a consequence, their bonds were snapped up by the Japanese insurance companies who were funding them in global money markets, France and so forth. And the backstop of all of that was public, these liquidity swaps with Bank of Japan and the European Central Bank. None of this is in the book, but I think it's relevant for connecting. That there's a money story. There's historians tell stories, okay, and they retell stories. And here I'm just trying to say there's a money story. There's a money story that is implied by all of the facts. Thank God historians dig up all these facts, so we can then try to hear them. So here's my second to last slide. I was just giving a talk just 2 weeks ago to the BIS about stablecoins. So this is the next iteration of this capitalism thing, right? It's not geography. It's now going into the cloud. And so what is this stablecoin thing? that stablecoins are securities, JP Morgan coin is deposits, central bank digital currency are kind of currency substitutes. So we're, as Sven emphasizes, this capitalism monster is like a shape-shifting thing. And so here's the current shape-shifting thing that is happening. And it's a money thing that is happening. And we want to pay attention to that. So here, by way of conclusion, two quotes. Augusto Pinochet, a sunglasses-wearing strongman who had little love for even the most basic human rights protection, became its unexpected prophet, the Lenin of neoliberalism. Don't you love that? The Lenin of neoliberalism. Okay, so this is about balance of payments. This is about Chile. This is about copper and so forth. So it's about the settlement constraint. The second one, the playing field was far from level. Capital played a global game while workers were by definition local. This is, now I want to reflect on this, by definition local. So this is illiquidity, right? If you're local, you can't, the settlement constraint binds on you. You can't move around, right? So I think this is a fascinating idea. And I think is that the last line? I think that's the last line.
Well, thank you, Perry. I think you opened up
Yeah.
quite a few avenues worthy of discussion, and I'm a bit afraid we might not get to all of them. So we might have to continue this into the liquidity happy hour later or another time. But without any further ado, Sven, please take the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I don't have a slideshow to present. And I don't know how long do you want me to speak for? I forgot.
You take the time you need. I'll cut you off at like 15 minutes max.
Okay.
Let's say 10 minutes.
It's going to be shorter. But let me just say, Perry, I really appreciate you having read the book, not just once, but twice. Except for myself and my editors, you're the only one who has done that, and I really also appreciate the kind of nuggets that you drew out of the book and the kind comments you made about the book. And look, I think my 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 main response to your presentation is I wish I would have hung out with you guys more. I think I would have learned a lot, and it would have been relevant to thinking about the global history of capitalism, and it would have perhaps strengthened some of my arguments as I gather from the presentation, and it might have complicated some others. So I mean, I do talk about financial instruments. I do talk about money, as Perry also pointed out. But I probably don't do that to a sufficient extent. And just in my defense, I have to say that I had about 1,000 balls in the air writing this book because it does deal with a 1,000-year history and it does deal with the entire globe. And there are many, themes, regions of the world, problems in the history of capitalism that are perhaps insufficiently dealt with. But the prime goal of the book was to think about capitalism as a whole and to think about it through time and to think about it globally. That meant I had to cut corners because, as you said, it's already a pretty long book. And technically, it is actually impossible, I was told, to publish a book that is any longer than this one because it can't be bound. So I went to the absolute technical maximum here of the space that could be found between two book covers. And so I'm perfectly aware that I leave things out. The money story is probably not fully told, and so other parts of the story of capitalism. But let me just say, what how I came to write this book is that I see a lot of people in the world today being quite interested in capitalism or parts of capitalism. People have strong opinions about it. They engage in heated conversations on it, but often they don't know much about it. And I thought that, and I still believe that capitalism can only be understood from a historical perspective. It needs to be understood as a radically new form of the organization of economic life that unfolded in history, and thus needs to be understood from this historical perspective. And I felt that I can contribute to this contemporary discussion by retelling the history of capitalism. And then, of course, capitalism today is, I somewhat disagree with Branko Milanovic, who entitled one of his books, as you know, Capitalism Alone. I think that's not the case. We are living in a world today in which there are still significant spheres of our lives that are outside the capitalist logic, as Perry also emphasized. But still, that said, we live in a world that is structured by the capitalist revolution in quite radical ways, and that has never is also structured radically by the capitalist revolution in ways that had never been the case before in human history. And so, to understand our world today, we need to understand how we got to this particular point. And this is what the book aims to do. The book is not, solely directed towards uh, you guys, Perry and everybody else on this call, because you think about these matters a great deal. But I wanted to write a book that also speaks to people who are just thinking about capitalism, but don't do that as a full-time occupation. And the responses to the book have shown that this is indeed the case. That I have a lot of readers who are generally interested in the world we live in today, or maybe in important aspects of its history, but are not, economists by training or historians or anything like that. Um, I have to push back a little bit on the notion that historians are telling stories. This is, historians do tell stories, and I do tell stories in the book. But the purposes of telling these stories, at least in my case, is because I believe that by looking very closely, sometimes at something very specific, allows us to see much clearer something that is very big. I start every chapter, as you mentioned, I start every chapter with either the history of one particular person or one particular place or one particular company or one particular political moment. But I do that because it does allow me to come to, I think, a much better understanding of this particular moment in the history of capitalism and the kinds of processes that are at its core. So, for example, you mentioned the question of decolonialization, the process of decolonialization, and also the impact of decolonialization on global capitalism, which I hold to be one of the most important processes in the history of capitalism and the history of the world in the 20th century. And I tell that story largely through the history of one Indian entrepreneur, namely the Godrej Company, because that exemplified the kind of peculiar link between decolonizing state and the emergence of private capital, capitalists and capitalism in South Asia. So historians do tell stories, but they tell them usually for a purpose, and the purpose is heavily analytical. And in my case, that is certainly the case. In the end, what I'm interested in is understanding this huge historical process, namely the advent and the spread of capitalism. So what the book tries to do is, as Perry remarked upon, but maybe I should emphasize that a little bit more, one of its core efforts is to denaturalize capitalism. So many discussions on capitalism assume either implicitly or explicitly, and that is certainly the case among many economists, if I may say so, in this distinguished group. They tend to think of the capitalist logic as something that has structured human life from times immemorial, and as Fernand Braudel also shows, and many others, this is not the case. The capitalist logic is a radical departure from other forms of economic life that have existed on planet Earth. And I try to, show how this radically new economic logic, how this spreads from relatively small communities of long distance merchants, as Brodel also emphasizes, how we get from these kinds of communities, which I call capitalists without capitalism, how we get from that word into a word of the present, where almost all of the kind of large processes that we inhabit and also some of the most intimate aspects of our lives today are deeply structured by the capitalist revolution. So capitalism is not natural. Capitalism is historical. And exactly for this reason, capitalism, I think, can also only be understood from a historical perspective. I think it's a pointless exercise to come up with ever more sophisticated kind of abstract discussions of capitalism. I mean, there is a place for that as well, and I'm using that in the book as well. But in the end, I think we can understand only capitalism as the really existing capitalism, as it actually unfolded, and how it changed over time. Then third, the book is, as you say, it's very global in orientation. So much of our thinking about capitalism has been heavily Eurocentric. We all know these stories about this, capitalism either kind of emerging in the city of Florence, or maybe in later in Amsterdam, or then if you think about Robert Brenner in the South English countryside, or other people think of capitalism being a story largely about Manchester and the spread of industry. And I disagree with all of this. I think you can understand capitalism only as from a global perspective. The book starts out with charting these merchant communities as they emerged in many different parts of the world. I focus in particular on the Arab world, but there are strong merchant communities in places such as China, India, and of course also in Southern Europe. And so this story about the emergence of long distance merchants, the emergence of capitalists, is a story that is truly global. But then, when we come to the mid 19th century, when capitalism is really at the height of creating global hierarchies that focus on the continent of Europe. So this is a Eurocentric moment, and of course, this is something that needs to be explained, and this is something that the book does explain. But even in those moments, the European story is deeply embedded, for example, in the transformation of the countryside in the American South. It's deeply embedded in European Asian trade. It's deeply embedded by the late 19th century of what happens in the coastal regions and then in the hinterlands of Africa. So even then, it can only be understood from a global perspective. And today, as we enter a world in which the most dynamic parts of the global capitalist economy are to be found, certainly not in Europe, and where no one in their right mind would think about capitalism by only looking at the European continent, it becomes, I think, patently obvious that we need to rethink the entire history of capitalism, and we need to rethink it from this global a global perspective. I put a strong emphasis on merchants, which actually you mentioned the Marxists, but many Marxists are very much opposed to that. But I'm trying to tell, as you remarked upon, I try to tell an actor-centric history. I try to explain, how this logic, this radically new logic, spread around the world. And I see merchants here as core actors in this process, and they're core actors in the first half of the second millennium, but they remain core actors well into the 19th century. As you also remark upon, I put great emphasis on the importance of the state. I actually argue that capitalism is one of the most statist economic civilizations ever. And yes, I think I do demonstrate that at all moments in the history of capitalism. What do states do? They, as you mentioned, they secure property rights, they enforce contracts, they engage in taxation, force monetarization, build empires, um, make. I wrote down something else. I cannot read it anymore. Uh, they create markets. I think states are everywhere in this history of capitalism, and I think the for me um, how and of course Brodel argues that as well in his Afterwards to a Material Civilization or something, his short book of his lectures that he gave at Johns Hopkins, and I think the explanation of how the state becomes so central in this history is that because the capitalist economic logic is such a radical departure of economic life, as you mentioned, it encounters a lot of resistances in many different parts of the world among very many different social groups. And to really break through, it does need an ally, and the ally is the state. And this is also something the kind of depth of the alliance between capitalists, between merchants, and the state is particularly pronounced on the European continent by the 15th and 16th century for reasons that have something to do with the relative weakness of European capital in the world and the relative weakness of European states. That drives them into one another's arms, and they kind of build, they support one another. And I think that is really then decisive for the breakthrough that this capitalist civilization experiences in the 16th and 17th centuries. Last but not least, maybe uh, I have so many notes now. Yes, yeah, okay. I wanted to say a few words about the history of economic thought. I totally agree with you. Again, much more could be said about it, and certainly I did leave out some traditions, maybe even important traditions in the history of economic thought. But the basic move that I try to make is I many books that deal with capitalism kind of have a preface, an early chapter in the book in which they present all the previous readings of the history of capitalism and then are kind of the referee in that discussion. And they say, oh, you know what? Smith was wrong and Marx was right, or Marx was wrong and Smith was right, or something like that. And I find these conversations more or less, I don't find them particularly productive. And so early on, I made another decision, and that was I want to bring this thinking about capitalism into the history of capitalism and to want to report on how people have interpreted the capitalist revolution at the moment at which they did. And so, for example, if you think about Marx, he comes into this book in the second half of the or in the middle of the 19th century, and this was a very particular, peculiar moment in the history of capitalism, and that also made certain things visible to him and other things invisible. And especially what was invisible to him was the future, as the future is also invisible to us today. And I take this thinking about economic life, this thinking about capitalism, as always kind of limited by the particular moment in which it occurs. And that's not no fault of the authors. I mean, Adam Smith largely wrote before there was much of modern industry. There are clearly very severe limits to what he was able to see in the late 18th century. But I try to present these interpretations of capitalism out of the particular moment in which they were made. And I should have probably put in more of the project that you guys are engaged in, thinking about money. I mean, this would have clearly been a great idea. I'm totally on board with that. But I didn't. What I found to be extremely illuminating was I spent some time thinking about feminist economics and the feminist thinking about economic life as it developed in the 1960s and 1970s. And to me, that there were very many very important insights into the dynamics of capitalism that I then also try to work through in the book at large, which is why we're dealing, for example, a lot with family life. So that to me was a tradition of economic thought that was probably not so much in the mainstream of the history of economic thought, but that was quite important to my thinking about the history of capitalism. And then, yeah, that just in closing, maybe I should just say, like you, Perry, I don't, I don't spend any time in the book, I think, kind of showing that some of the secondary literature is right or is wrong. And I also agree with you that a lot of it is wrong, but I don't point that out in the book at all because I find these conversations often rather boring. And I did, I did do a lot of archival research. I researched this book on all continents, from Uzbekistan to Australia to Brazil to Senegal to Mexico to all kinds of places in the US and in Europe and India and many other places. And so there's a lot of that, but there's also, of course, a lot that I draw from the secondary literature. And I basically approach the secondary literature in the sense that in almost any work there is something important, something that helped me think through the history of capitalism, and I emphasized that. But let me just say in closing, thank you so much for reading the book so carefully. Thank you so much for reading it twice. I'm really so delighted that it spoke to you and that it was in some ways maybe important to your thinking about the problem at hand. And I promise, if I will ever write another global history of capitalism, um, thinking about money will become more important in this book. I mean, I did teach with Chris Dizon for a long time, and I did think about that. It's somewhat in the book, to the best of my ability, it's in the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven. So I before Yakov will speak, but I just want to underline what you said about denaturalizing. So I really think that's very important to uh you said many things that I'm going to think about, but that's the one that I just want to underline for everyone else. That this is not what society was like. And it's not what a lot of society is like even now. I often think that my in my own life, I say I really want to remove myself from the market economy and not to have to rely on making money. I because that's irritating. It's irritating. So
But in a way, if I may add one more thing, and this is exactly the difficulty, I think, in thinking about capitalism, that we live in capitalism, and it is, it's the only. I mean, as far as I can tell, I mean, maybe some people in your audience grew up in North Korea or maybe even in the Soviet Union and know another word, but for most of us, we never lived in another word. This is the word we have grown up with, and it makes sense intuitively to think of that word as kind of natural. And what I think, and that's obviously the project you're engaged with as well, which I'm completely on board with. And that is, you need to make the world we live in strange. You need to make it peculiar. You need to even make it weird. You need to look at it. I sometimes put myself into this position, like, what is it going to look like 1,000 years from now when people live in a completely different world, if they live at all, and they look back to this moment and they will think it's like weird, strange. What did these people do? I think we need to take on this position in order to really understand the world we live in. And that's, of course, not easy, but we can make an effort here.
thank you, Sven.
Thank you, Perry.
Andy,
Thank you.
thank you so much. And I would like to, I have taken my moderator privilege to just emphasize a point as well. As a student of both of you, I guess, in this point is to sort of say that it's not easy to be taking minority views or taking views that are not 100% mainstream in whatever discipline and trying to weave through, taking deep insights that a tradition brings, but at the same time, making them compatible with what your lived experience or your archival research actually shows. And doing that over 1,000 years is an incredible achievement. What I would really appreciate, and that's why I think we're all in the Money View, we gravitated from many different places in the world, from many different ways, is because we feel it has an open system. It's compatible with other ways of doing things out of the web. It's a language that we can speak with different in different places. We can recognize different patterns, and it doesn't lock us down. It's not dogmatic in the way that if you I showed you the slides at the beginning. If you take any one of those statements by themselves, you close the system down, which is exactly what neoclassical economics does to some degree. Which is that's when it becomes dogma, when it becomes a end all be all system where you cannot integrate other ways and other evidence into that way. That's when it becomes problematic. And I think we really appreciate the fact that you were able to synthesize so many different systems of thinking into a book, and we'll definitely be studying it. But yeah, end of moderator's privilege. Yakov, you have your discussion as well. Please go ahead.
All right, guys, I have a lot of comments that I wrote up during the presentation. I initially thought, well, why should I be there? We now have the book author, so he should respond to the talk about the book. But now I actually think it's a pretty good thing that I'm here, because I sit at a very interesting nexus point between you two guys. I'm trained as a PhD historian. My work is in history, but I also have a background in economics, and I was trained especially by Perry, who I consider as much my dissertation, my Doktorvater, as my formal advisor in the history department. Interestingly, Sven, had one of your students, I think you actually were for formal chair on my committee when she was a junior professor. She was the junior reader. So I do sit pretty well, Vanessa.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I do sit pretty well between you guys, and I think I can work as a bit of a translator. I will give one note, though. I, unlike Perry, did not read the book twice. I did not even read it deeply. I skimmed it in the last 2 days. However, I have read your other work, which Empire Cotton, and the book on New York City, of which I really like the one on New York City the most, which tells you something about me being the historian who was trained formally in history seminars. So, but again, I am now formally working as an economist in quasi-private, and now that I've started my own side business, private practice, working on project finance and money market connections and advising on that. If you need that, send me an email. I'm cheaper than many, but because they're not hiring PhD historians of the USSR much in history departments these days, especially ones that do a lot of math in their book. Yeah. Now, let me first defend, like Sven did, what my discipline does. We don't tell stories. What I think we're quite good at is the interrogation of narratives. In fact, I think there is a difference between how a historian reads an academic work of history and how someone outside of the discipline does, in the sense that a historian is constantly thinking about what we call historiography, which is the interrogation of previous historians' narratives and how we position themselves against them. I think because of that, we are quite good at telling stories, but that's not what we're trying to do. We are trying to interrogate them and reposition them using new evidence. Obviously, like anyone, like for an economist, our archive is the database, but our model, as I would put it, is the historiography. Now, to defend my semi-profession as an economist, I think economists do something else. Even economists like Perry, who are old institutionalists, which is kind of what I consider myself. Economists are, in the end, driven by a theory. We are deductive thinkers, now that I put my economist hat on. We look, even when we're studying change over time in institutions and being very attentive to them, we are looking at institutions as a kind of study, as a kind of animal, something to be studied to better understand a broader point. I think both sides have strong points and weaknesses that we can address to one another. I think when we think of historians, and we think about historiography and narrative, we implicitly, I think, assume that truth and the world is made through the communication of facts, not just the creation and analysis of facts. And that communication has to be interrogated and understood as a construction through which is as much a piece of truth as the mechanics of a transaction. On the other hand, and I make this point in my book a lot, this is my pitch for reading Building a Ruin, my history of the collapse of the Soviet Union through the lens of the money view, actually, which I'll get to at the end of this. We are very bad at being explicitly theoretical. And I think that's bad. And this is why, because I think there is no scientific study of anything without a theoretical bias. That's Hume's point when he talks about the microscope not representing reality, but being influenced by the calibration of the lens. I think we need to be very honest about, yes, the E.H. Carr thing is great, even if I think E.H. Carr is wrong about many things. That is, I think, something we don't do and we don't represent the bias of. And I think that gets us into trouble, especially these days when we are trying to apply our work and make it legible to others. So to kind of put this into broader perspective, I think Sven is doing two things. He is extending what is the classic Wallerstein-Brenner debate in the 70s about the origins of capitalism, whether it is kind of this global system that is mostly driven by colonial commodity flow, or whether it is a class struggle basis that starts in the European countryside. And I think he's giving a particular history of capitalism school, this Harvard school that I think exists, flavor to it, which is that it is very much a story about commodity flow, but also a study of commodity flow, not like Wallerstein would do it, but like influenced by, I think, the cultural history side of things, which is studying the cultures of the merchants and the people there. That's what I have always found in Sven's work. I'm not a person who likes the history of capitalism. I've been there, I worked with it. This is not what I do, but this is how I read the history of capitalism, is basically taking cultural history, trying to apply it to the economy. So I also, that's why, Perry, I don't think what we're dealing with is always social history, or at least social history as we'd see it in the 70s. And for that reason, I actually don't think Sven is that much of a Marxist as you would think. Maybe some kind of Marxist, but I don't think he's focused on the development of the means of production as much as I would be, because I do think of myself as someone who is not a Marxist politically, but I think Marx has a lot of analytical points. But the transmission and creation of communities of commodity translation. And that's, I think there's something really interesting when he gets in this discussion about Fordism, because Fordism is hyper-fixed capitalist, and fixed capital is someone who builds actual large-scale energy projects these days, which is all about fixed capital, is just forces you to think in the money view, because all that is a set of discounted cash flows, and that discounted cash flow is actually not driven by anything physical about the project, but by the conditions of the money market in the end. I'll get to why that's important in a second. My pushback on all of this, or at least my position on all of these debates, is I think we should come at this even more from the point of view of Charles Tilly than Beckert and Sven does, even though I know you've been influenced by him. I actually want to come at it harder. I think when I was reading this literature, I think what doesn't get mentioned a lot is Rosenthal's work and the Wang and Rosenthal work. Arbin Wang, and I forget Rosenthal's full name. But they make a point, I think, an extending Tilly's analysis about merchants and the state that I think is very important, is that the European approach to managing the merchant community is different than what you would find in, the management of Islamic merchants, East Asian merchants before the coming of the European state, in the sense that the European state is unique. It is really fragmented and unable to build an empire internally. And thus it is geared for war. It is really good at organizing violence. It's also why the capital intensivity of European, even pre-capitalist production is higher. It's because they happen to be more often located in cities because cities are defendable. And what we get at from there is that the state, which starts out as this, bandit figure until he becomes a stationary bandit, is not just has to interact with the merchants in a different way. They're trying to manage the merchant community initially as a way to maximize their ability to do violence on other bandits and secure their sovereignty. And I think this creates, to me, a really interesting tension in the history of capitalism and the state. On one hand, what defines the state is sovereignty, the recognition of the inviolate of your borders by other entities that can do violence. On the other hand, merchants, if you let them be, have to be global. They want to do trade. They want to expand trade. And what's key to that is the creation of liquidity. So I come at this from Perry's money view. I think money is critical, and money starts as a private instrument. It starts something that starts in the community of merchants. What the state wants to do is tap that, initially for war, but as we get through history, also for development, for peace, eventually for social welfare. But also the contrary there is to control, or like I would say, manage the aspects of liquidity. Because if you get it too far out there, it turns into not only initially a loss of your sovereignty, but a loss by the creation of chaos. And I think that dance between liquidity as wanting to be global as much as possible within some system, and the state, which is ultimately a sovereign, is a violent one, I think. And that's not a bad or a good thing. That's just what states do initially at their core. They fight, they wage war. That is, as you point out, like Sven, and that narrative about war capitalism, I think, is true, but I think it's not an ending point. I think that's where we get at liquidity. That management of the merchant as a tool of war is even more important than I think you emphasize. And from there comes the management of liquidity. So the person I like the most in the world, who I think is underappreciated, one of my Mount Rushmore figures, is Alexander Gerschenkron, who is kind of the only person I can think of who thinks like a historian about narratives, but is also an economist. Because he thinks that look, there's this story of capital development, and there's ways of doing that, and he's probably right on some ways, and the Gerschenkron index is not real, but it's a useful stab. We've gone past it, but it's there. But most importantly, in his work of backwardness in economic perspective, he thinks the key to getting on that capital development flow is actually narrative, and particularly the understanding of one as backwards and vulnerable vis-a-vis the world system and vis-a-vis the world of advanced capitalism. And that's actually kind of new. Reminds me a lot of Bailey, who I know is also you're a big fan of. Now he talks about modernity as once you're in modernity, it's because you're aware of modernity. You are aware of change over time and global. And that's the economic version. But here's where I think things get interesting. What does Gerschenkron study? He studies intellectuals, those who articulate narratives, and he notes that intellectuals, the key institution for intellectuals to interact with the merchant world is the bank, because the bank is the driver of capital stock formation. And what did Perry study? He studies the bank. In fact, Perry says the bank is the model of all economic transactions. We are all banks at the end. The other thing I think Perry gets at, though I don't think he articulates it that way, or as I always understood Perry, is that the bank is really a community. It's a community of bankers. that extend liquidity to one another. They allow overnight, like the key of banking is the ability to borrow quickly from other bankers. And what the history of central banking, as Perry describes it, I think is the eventual takeover of that private function of the community of merchants, which has always been there as long as there's been long distance trade. What's different about European capitalism is that it starting with Sweden, actually, first, not the Bank of England, but that's a different thing. It starts to take over the function of regulating the community of lending merchants. First, for the purposes of war. Second, eventually for the purposes of peace. That is what central bankers do. They coordinate between the community of merchants and the purposes of the state. And I think that's
Yakov,
why
I think this is very good.
Can I make one more point?
One more point. We have to transition to the next session in 5 minutes, and I would like to give the word to Sven and Perry one more time before you do.
Here's what I'll give you as my case study. I'm a historian of explicitly anti-capitalist projects, and what anti-capitalist projects do is not what capitalist projects do in any regard. They are not trying to manage liquidity. They are trying to stop liquidity from happening. They are trying to be the only, they are trying to not be liquid at all in the ideal sense. That's frankly what, Kornai would say and stuff. And what happens in practice, despite, internationalist language, is none of these anti-capitalist projects, like the one I study, which is the Soviet Union, ever figures out how to not be hyper-sovereigntist because of that. No matter what they try, because no one's figured that out yet. And no one knows how to get out of the world of liquidity anymore once it's already been unleashed. And like modernity. The weird thing, though, is liquidity, even in these societies, pops up in weird places. They can't be avoided as long as you're starting to focus so much on industrialization and capital stock. Liquidity pops up, and these societies are, because they want to kill liquidity, they want liquidity not to exist, are terrible at managing it, and that's their Achilles heel.
Nice.
That was a lot. Sorry.
No, I totally appreciate it. I think everybody does. And since we're a community, we have the ability to wiggle around a little bit on the margins here. And I would like to spend a couple of minutes allowing Perry and Sven to respond. And I'm very sorry that the audience didn't get a chance to really engage this conversation, though we all wanted to. So I guess this has to be postponed to the liquidity happy hour. And Sven, if you allow, we can bring you back very soon. But Perry and Sven, you get the last word. You can take as much time as you'd like. We're for the next speakers. I hope you allow that. Thank you so much.
Well, I'll start. I want to just pick up on that last point that Yakov made, which is the anti-capitalists are trying to avoid liquidity, and I just link that to what I said before about Fordism. That the Fordists are basically anti-capitalists in that same regard. That they're by vertical integration, horizontal integration. This is an attempt to internalize, the control over your supply chain, so that you don't have to face this settlement constraint. And actually, that's sort of Soviet. So just to make that link.
Great book about that by another person I think came out of Sven's world, whose name I just literally forgot, but history of Fordism.
Stefan Link. Yeah.
How can I forget Stefan's name? Jesus Christ. Sorry. I feel bad.
Shall I say something too?
Yes, you get the final words then. Please go ahead.
I don't want to say much. I think Perry's last comment about the kind of Fordist industrialists being kind of anti-capitalist. I think that's somewhat problematic because I think this is and this relates to something that we have discussed before that capitalism is quite undogmatic. It can shift its shape quite drastically, and in important moments in the history of capitalism, markets play a different role than at other moments in the history of capitalism. And yes, the Fordist project is very much about the internalizing of markets and vertical and horizontal integration, as Alfred Chandler has shown, but it. I don't think it's really anti-capitalist. It's just a different kind of capitalism. It's one of these moments in which capitalism shifts its form and also then develops a new relationship to the state. And then just two quick comments. Yakov, I so much agree with the story that you told about the European state and state formation and how this plays into the great divergence. And I also very much appreciate your call out to Charles Tilly, who was one of my dissertation advisors and who I think has said really many important things about exactly this problem. And I just disagree with one thing, and this is I don't think the history of maybe you're right in the sense that many works in the history of capitalism are quite culturalist. That is probably true. But I think the history of capitalism that I just wrote it does deal with bourgeois culture and working class culture at certain points in time. But this is, I think, a topic that is not fully developed, and I see myself clearly as not a cultural historian.
Thank you, Sven.
Well, yes, please join me in thanking everybody. Perry for the keynote, Sven for the amazing book contribution, and for being here as a discussant, for taking the time. Yakov, of course, we always appreciate you.
Thank you,
This was a great
guys.
discussion. And what it does, it opens us up to a very inspiration to think deeply about things, and that's what we're here to do. So, and liquidity helps with that. So, we're happy to have that. So, I will stop the recording for a moment.